In the run-up to 1999's The Blair Witch Project, the fake documentary Curse of the Blair Witch was aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. This documentary detailed a series of incidents that made up the fabricated local legends of the Blair Witch. The Blair Witch Project would go on to be a major hit, popularising the found footage style of horror films, as well as being one of the first films to use the internet as a major component of its marketing. As with any success story, focus quickly shifted to franchise building. In addition to beginning work on a sequel, an agreement to develop a trilogy of games would be made between distributor Artisan Entertainment and publisher Gathering of Developers during E3 of 1999. The games would be released the following year. Each game would be made by a different developer and focused on a different event detailed in the Curse of the Blair Witch. The incredibly tight deadlines, less than a year and a half of development, resulted in works that are, if not good, certainly interesting, so we're going to be having a look at all three of them today. The first volume, Rustin Parr, was developed by Terminal Reality. They'd previously worked on their own game Nocturne, a pulp-action survival horror game that I spoke about previously. Nocturne would have an influence on all three games. Its engine would be used as the basis of each, so the basic gameplay mechanics and rhythm would feature throughout. But its influence would be felt most strongly in this first volume. So much so that Rustin Parr acts almost as a soft sequel to Nocturne. As someone who liked Nocturne, this is a nice treat, but it's fair to say the vibes are diametrically opposed to the game's source material. You take on the role of Dr. Elspeth Holliday, a supporting member of secret US government paranormal research division, colloquially known as Spook House. It's 1940 and Doc Holliday's mission is to investigate the Rustin Parr murders, during which Parr mutilated and killed 7 children from the town of Burkittsville, leaving one survivor, claiming to have done it at the behest of the witch. It's Elspeth's first mission, and it was a good choice to make her the protagonist rather than the stranger of Nocturne. Holliday is a normal enough person that she fits in well when the game is trying to be a more serious survival horror investigation, whereas Stranger is a pulp action hero through and through. He does feature at a few moments throughout the plot, and whenever he does, he feels completely out of place. The game exists between two tones, a pulpy action horror adventure and a more serious survival horror investigation. Both are entertaining in their own way, though they never mesh well with one another successfully, instead lurching from one to the other. However, neither are particularly in line with the Blair Witch Project, which is a problem for a licensed game. These two modes are well represented in the game's first part. It opens with Doc Holliday training within Spook House, complete with the full cast of characters from your vaguely Asian training instructor to Svetlana, the half-vampire. I'd say it's tonally as far as you could possibly get from the slow burn, understated horror of the Blair Witch Project, but I've played the rest of these games. Reaching Burkittsville, however, the game slows down and takes on a more reserved, investigative tone. With a cover story claiming your niece went missing and you wonder if Rustin Parr may have had something to do with it, you start to question the townsfolk. There's a slightly eclectic but ultimately believable cast of characters arrayed throughout the town's main street, and questioning them, uncovering what they know through their small town distrust of outsiders, slowly building rapport with some of the more helpful townsfolk is very engaging, and not a million miles away from the tone of the opening interviews of the film. Then the whole town turns into monsters and you have to gun them all down. This sudden shift is obviously a dream sequence, but it's demonstrative of the game's inability to stick to a quieter, more serious tone set by the less pulpy sequences. The decision to fall back on more familiar tones and characters is an understandable one, though. Volume 1 is by far the longest of the three games, easily as long as the other two combined. A lot of that is to do with the developers' relative familiarity with working in the engine, as well as the fact that they could reuse so much established content and ideas to stretch the game out a bit. This goes in two directions as well. While characters and the tone of Nocturne pop in and out of the plot, the monsters faced in the dream sequence are identified as Demites, monsters that would appear in the developer's next game, Blood Rain. Later, you also fight stick figures in the woods, who can only be defeated by destroying their heart, which are mechanically and visually reminiscent of that game's final boss as well. When you aren't fighting in the woods, however, the game can actually be quite atmospheric. This is an area where a weakness of Nocturne becomes a strength for Rustin Parr. The fixed camera angles can make wandering the narrow pathways of the woods quite disorienting, and while this was a drawback in Nocturne, getting all turned around in Lost in the Woods is very much on brand for a Blair Witch game. The woods are quite expansive and you'll slowly build out a map of the area across a few different in-game days. Initially, the focus is simply on finding specific places within the woods, and during these early sections of the game, slips into actually feeling like a reasonably authentic adaptation. More so when the woods start to shift. While the whole of the area loops back on itself eventually, occasionally, the game will lock you into a specific area, looping it until you complete an objective, often disabling your map or even plunging the area into darkness as you do so. As the game goes on though, this quieter and more tense mode of play slowly slides away and the woods fill with monsters to fight. Ammo and health items are never plentiful, maintaining a level of anxiety throughout, but are never so low that you have to be picky over which fights you take on, especially since enemies won't respawn on any given day, so it's possible to clear the woods entirely. The narrative similarly starts out hopeful enough as a quiet small town paranormal investigation, but quickly gives way to pulpy over-the-top nonsense instead. Having briefly investigated Coffin Rock and the burnt-out remains of Rustin Parr's house, Doc Holliday is ready to call off the search and let Spookhouse know there isn't enough evidence for a full investigation. Then an owl leads her to a clearing with an old Native American shaman in it, and any hopes of the game maintaining tonal cohesion with the film that inspired it disappears. The idea that the Black Hills woods near Burkittsville were always evil, long before the Blair Witch took up residence in them, isn't completely terrible. It's the kind of plot point that a weak sequel might introduce. But the reveal that everything is the result of an ancient demon that lives in the area is just silly. The incorporation of wildly generalised and inaccurate Native American mysticism is just the nail in the coffin. The game can't decide whether it's a demon or a spirit, or whether the Native Americans worshipped it or fought it, but they call it Hakaitamix, and it's going to be the main villain of the trilogy going forwards. Even the plan going forwards becomes unclear. Hakaitamix is currently possessing Kyle Brody, the child who survived Rustin Parr, who hasn't spoken since, despite his testimony being vital in finding Parr guilty. It's a hole in the plot, but hardly the biggest problem it has going for it. Using Kyle, he's been influencing the local priest in an attempt to sacrifice another local child. There's also some connections to a Native American child who's been trapped suffering in another plane of reality, being tortured by Hakaitamix for several hundred years. There's a few false endings, one where you gun down a priest in the street and get kicked out of Spookhouse, another where you gun down the townsfolk after hallucinating monsters, an event the earlier dream sequence was premonition of to warn you from. But the correct sequence of actions is to hit the priest with a shovel and then run away, which is not something I was expecting to get up to in a Blair Witch game. Despite the game straying so far from the tonality and narratives established by the films, it does at least try to incorporate elements, not just the general idea of the Rustin Parr murders, but also in other ways. A major case of help in the late game comes from Robin Weaver, the girl who went missing during the previous event attributed to the witch, and in the basement of Rustin Parr's house, Holiday experiences a vision of Heather and Mickey during the finale of the film. But by the time you and the recently arrived stranger are stealing that Native American child from Hakaitamix so you can use them as bait to lock the demon in the Shadow Realm for 1,000 years, you'll realise that this is about as far from tonally cohesive as you can get. It has a lot of competition in that regard though, not just from the other two volumes, but from the film's own official sequel as well. Coming out the same year as the games, Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 is a strong rival for being the most tonally inconsistent with its source material. The studio selected director Joe Berlinger due to his history of working on documentaries, believing that it would give the sequel an authentic feeling similar to the original, but his background actually had the opposite effect. Berlinger was far more interested in exploring the response to the original film, rather than continuing its fiction. Examining the hysteria and response to such a culturally significant event as the marketing and release of the Blair Witch Project is actually a pretty good instinct, but the result was a convoluted mess, edgy and silly in equal parts, and wildly tonally dissonant. It was a very disappointing sequel for people who were hoping for a continuation of the film student's story, or were hoping for an expansion of the Blair Witch lore. But I wonder if they would have preferred the approach of the volumes by expanding the lore to include Native American demons and such like. It's the kind of thing a different awful sequel might have introduced, and it's interesting to see the project get both kinds of sequels, in a way. Between Book of Shadows and the 3 volumes, I think Volume 2 is actually the closest thing to a sequel fans may have enjoyed. It's still closer in tone to the other games than the original film, but the specifics of its exploration of the Coffin Rock incident get it closer than the others. Volume 2 is the least pulpy, and the only one of the 3 to not include any explicit mention of Native Americans, which can be considered an improvement over the stereotyped inclusion of the others. It's particularly notable that Volume 2 was developed by Human Head Studios, who would go on to develop 2006's Prey alongside 3D Realms. Prey would include many elements of Native American mysticism, but developers would base that depiction specifically upon, and consult extensively and specifically with Cherokee experts, to ensure an authentic and focused depiction, something that certainly wasn't done for these games. The focus of Volume 2 is much tighter than its companions. The legend of Coffin Rock centres on the disappearance of the child, Robin Weaver, around 1880, the same child who grows up to help Doc Holliday in Volume 1. The child returns on her own, seemingly unharmed, but a search party would be found later, mutilated and arranged in a pentagram upon Coffin Rock. Action follows a man given the ever-so-subtle moniker of Lazarus. He's found gravely wounded in the woods by Robin and nursed back to health by her mother. Robin goes missing during his convalescence, so Lazarus is compelled by her mother and a strange voice in his head to find the missing child. The legend of Coffin Rock is more linear than either of the other volumes. It lacks the large open forest of the first and third, instead leading you through a sequence of areas. Doing so, however, the narrative switches between the 1880s and Lazarus' search for the child, and his time in the area during the Civil War. The shifts back and forth aren't too badly implemented, though usually it's a one-for-one system. You travel through the area in a memory sequence before repeating the same area in the darker present. That said, the two narratives are relatively solid. In the 1880s, Lazarus tries to follow Robin, occasionally encountering the doomed search party, who are naturally distrustful of him. Meanwhile, in the past, Lazarus, then named Robert McNichol, leads his squad in hunting a group of Confederate sappers, attempting to disrupt the local railroad. The atmosphere of both is relatively effective, especially the areas outside the woods. It's clear that Human Head Studios were lacking in experience with the engine compared to Terminal Reality. They don't get as much use out of the lighting system and tend towards more drawn-back camera angles. The flat lighting, however, does lend itself well to the open fields surrounding the woods. Combined with the muted colours, much of the game ends up with a mood fitting of its time and setting. It feels appropriately antiquated and rural, not dissimilar to the famous painting American Gothic or a Steinbeck novel, despite both of them being set a little later. It's a nice touch that the other episodes don't manage as well, though it does slip away more and more the deeper you venture into the Black Hills forest. The Civil War sections of the game would actually be really well paced if they were played consecutively. There's a gradual descent into the paranormal as you delve deeper into the woods, starting out fighting Confederate soldiers on the outskirts, slowly shifting as the Confederates start panicking, fighting against the local wildlife, until supernatural elements start to take out your men, eventually leading the squad to scattering. It would be well paced if it wasn't interspersed with Lazarus in the present fighting Confederate ghosts with a wood axe. Lazarus' present goes too hard with the supernatural elements too quickly, reducing the impact of the Civil War era. The reveal that Lazarus has been dead this whole time isn't a particularly surprising one. Between his deathly grey skin and his head containing both a sinister voice and a bullet hole, it's not a particularly strong twist when his final remaining squad member shoots him, thinking he's a hallucination trying to trick him. It's a better plot point than the resolution to Robin's story, however. Hakaitamix is trying to possess Robin, though the game never mentions the spirit's name, so you could imagine it's the actual Blair Witch. Like Rustin Parr in the future, a strange hermit has been tricked into helping their plans, though this time with promises of power rather than threats of madness. The search party was murdered to facilitate the possession, so Lazarus, having realised he's already dead, disrupts the ritual, absorbs the spirit's power into himself instead, and then fights the monstrously transformed hermit in the burnt-out remains of Rustin Parr's house. Chronologically impossible, but a nice nod to the Blair Witch's understated manipulation of time that would be made more explicit in the 2016 film. The ending's a little over the top, which makes it surprising that the voice in Lazarus's head, the person who resurrected him, is never explicitly identified. Initially, it seems like it may be the Blair Witch herself, which creates some nice tension early on, making it unclear exactly what your role is in the story, though later the implication is that it's Robin Weaver's grandmother. Robin has some connection with the spirits of the forest, but it's mentioned that her grandmother's connection was even stronger. Either way, Lazarus succumbs to his injuries, and in death keeps her Chitomix from entering the world proper. The rest of the story progresses as the future would record it. Robin is found confused but unharmed sometime later, going on to aid Elspeth Holiday in the 40s. Meanwhile, the search team are found sometime later at Coffin Rock, further cementing the legend of the Blair Witch. Of the 3 volumes, it's the one that could most easily fit with the narrative laid out by the film. Tonally, it still differs quite dramatically, still leaning towards explicitly supernatural encounters and combat over slow burn confusion, but it feels a more fitting inclusion in the franchise than the other volumes. Certainly, it's still combat heavy and janky as ever, with some encounters beginning far too soon after a load and often leading you to a too great a deficit of resources. But the more focused nature of the narrative, and the fact it doesn't get quite as bogged down in adding to the background lore, does make it my favourite of the 3. I had hoped that the 3rd game would continue the trend of this one, that the pulpy sensibilities of Rustin Parr was simply a quirk of Terminal Reality's design methodology. A fool's hope, unfortunately. The 2016 film, simply titled Blair Witch, is a fairly mediocre sequel to the original. Certainly not as far off base as Book of Shadows was, but it doesn't feel like it has too many ideas of its own. It's a clear attempt to recreate the strengths of the original, but without the advantages the original had of not following 16 years of other found footage horror films. It wound up feeling decidedly uninspired. Made worse by the simple fact that modern cameras are too high quality to evoke the struggle to make out shapes in the noise the original equipment benefited from. It also lacks the patience to have the slow burn pacing of the original, instead ratcheting up the supernatural occurrences too rapidly. The result is that, despite an attempt to return to what made the franchise popular in the first place, it's only really worth watching for the final sequence, which, to be fair, is extremely solid. Volume 3, The Elly Kedward Tale, is similarly trying to return to the beginning of the franchise, though this time narratively rather than aesthetically, with an exploration of Elly Kedward, the Blair Witch herself. It probably shouldn't have. Jonathan Pry is the protagonist this time around, renowned witch hunter facing a crisis of faith. It's the 1700s, and he sets off to Burkittsville, then called Blair, to investigate reports of demons having assaulted the village after the recent exile of a certain witch. Pry actually appeared briefly in Volume 1 as a ghostly apparition, providing helpful information to Doc Holliday in much the same way Robin Weaver did, which ties the games together nicely, even if the events of Volume 3 don't match up with his reports of them in Volume 1. Visually, Pry looked slightly out of place in the first game. The brevity of his cameo and the ghostliness means that this mostly went unnoticed, but the reason becomes apparent here. Ritual Entertainment, developers of the 3rd game, utilised a more exaggerated style for their characters, slightly oversized heads and quite bright or high contrast clothing with large details. It's not hugely distracting, but it does subtly shift the tone, a tone shift that will become more noticeable as the game goes on, and will end up even more tonally off base than the first volume. Ritual Entertainment previously worked on the shooters Sin and one of the Quake level packs. They would also go on to develop Elite Force 2, a Star Trek first-person shooter I've spoken about previously. This background makes it unsurprising that Volume 3 is the most action-focused of the games, and to their credit, they've done a good job of shifting the engine subtly to provide a better experience in that regard, but this comes at the expense of any of its horror roots. Enemies become more clearly highlighted when locked on with the auto-aim, and upon death will drop health, ammo, and mana, because you have a full mana bar in this Blair Witch game. Plus, these pickups will no longer require actively picking them up, you just run over them like it's Quake. The game also tends towards larger scale fights against multiple enemies, in arenas where the camera pulls back to reveal the entire area. These changes result in not just the most action-focused of the 3 Blair Witch games, but is even more action-focused than Nocturne that came before it. The changes do actually improve the gameplay experience in this regard. The game does feel better to play as an action game than the others, but that hardly seems appropriate for a Blair Witch game. If it hasn't become apparent by this point, I'll state it obviously. The Blair Witch games end up having very little to do with the Blair Witch or the films that invented her. Despite using elements from the backstory, they're mostly interested in inventing their own setting with their own tone. This isn't something I have a problem with. I'm far more interested in developers making the game they want rather than adhering to franchise expectations, but I recognise I'm in the minority in this regard. Most people would want a Blair Witch game to match up with the tone and narrative set forth by the films. Like Rustin Parr not actually appearing in Rustin Parr, Elly Kedward doesn't appear in the Elly Kedward Tale. It's all Hekaitomix, or Hekatomix as they're calling him now, despite the fact that the Native American shaman talking about him appears to be the same one from Volume 1, implied to be cursed with immortality during the events of this game. It's silly, and by the end the narrative will reach even higher levels of absurdity, far beyond the pulp sensibilities of Volume 1. You'd be forgiven for forgetting it's a Blair Witch game at all, and while it is, even more so than the first two, a very poor Blair Witch game, it's worth examining it on its own merits too. Not that it does great in that regard. Despite smoothing out the combat loops to be more engaging, Volume 3 has a huge amount of particularly unengaging wandering through the woods. Like Volume 1, there's a large open area of woods, but unlike that game, you're always provided with a map showing the location of your next objective. Despite enemies respawning, they are few and far between enough, and weak enough, that a shotgun blast will usually deal with them before they can even start moving, and since they drop resources now, there's no tension in that regard. Visually, it's even more impressive than Terminal Reality's entry, but despite this, wandering around Ritual's snowy rendition of the Black Hills forest lacks any tension, and the atmosphere isn't enough to stop its inclusion from feeling like a dull commute between objectives. It feels far more like padding, despite being shorter than the other two games. The objectives are, if not thematically appropriate, entertainingly varied. You're usually bouncing back and forth between the town and some point in the forest. This starts out as standard investigations of Coffin Rock and Kedway's house at the behest of the townsfolk, but it quickly shifts to working with a jailed witch and the aforementioned shaman to rescue a series of missing children. In working with the two, you expand your arsenal from a basic pistol and shotgun to a wide variety of spells, from chain lightning and flaming circles to heals and freezes, even a Bible that lets you exorcise enemies at the cost of your own health. It's a nicely varied set of weapons, more than the other two games combined, which further aids the combat being decently entertaining, if still a little janky. I can't dance around the Native American issue anymore. I mentioned the inclusion or lack of inclusion in the other two games, but Volume 3 includes Native American elements most extensively, to the almost complete elimination of Elly Kedward from her own game, and the rendition is heavily based on lazy stereotypes and mixing with more traditionally Western ideas. The spirit and demon planes, for example. You travel to each as part of your mission to save the various children taken by Hekaitomix. Mechanically and aesthetically, the two areas add some much needed variety from the atmospheric but repetitive snowy woods around Blair. The spirit realm is especially distinctive, a series of buttes and caves connected with rope bridges, all set above a foggy canyon. Narratively, however, it's not nearly as interesting. Functionally, the spirit and demon planes are just the Christian concepts of heaven and hell, with a vaguely Native American coat of paint over the top. The spirit plane is where great warriors go when they die, and the demon plane is where demons live. There's no basis for this in Native American mythology, or religious traditions. It's just basic Western mythological standards applied to a stereotyped Native American aesthetic. The game isn't even particularly respectful of its own rendition of things. Travel between planes was established in Volume 1. The famous stick figures can be used to create pathways between different places and times, and using one in a special place helps you get to the spirit plane. The demon plane, though, requires more work. It can't be reached with a regular stickman, it needs special magic. You need to build the stickman from the bones of a powerful Native American warrior. If I was surprised to be hitting a priest with a shovel in Rustin Parr, nothing prepared me for turning into a bear to convince a pair of ghost guards of your courage so they'll let you desecrate a sacred Native American burial ground. You could argue that the desecration of sacred spaces by colonial forces is historically accurate, but I don't think that was the goal. Desecration and destruction of sacred lands by the US continues to this day, from the pipeline through the Standing Rock Sioux reservations to the destruction of land to build Trump's border wall. Reducing this desecration to a fetch quest that passes without comment is an unfortunately common but nonetheless disrespectful inclusion. I recognise that the very tight development time of the game would make meaningful consultation with Native American expertise difficult, but I do feel avoiding the inclusion altogether would have been preferable to these rather lazy stereotypes. The inclusion has so little to do with authentic Native American traditions of any tribe that there's no reason they couldn't have been switched out for something else entirely. Local researchers, historians, or even other witches could have fulfilled the same narrative requirement without as much colonial baggage. True that Wicca faces similar misunderstandings and misappropriation, but it would at least have been stylistically and thematically resonant with the original work. I labour the point a little, because in many ways the lazy inclusion of stereotyped Native American mysticism is the biggest tonal and thematic problem with the trilogy. The action focus and reduction in horror are a major shift, but it's an understandable one as adaptations necessary for the changing medium, especially given the era and length of development. Long before horror games such as 2019's Blair Witch, flawed though it is, had been developed, let alone become popular. Adapting franchises to somewhat ill-fitting video game genres was far more common at the time, but switching out the Blair Witch for Hecatomics, changing the franchise's central figure for a new character behind it all, betrays the narrative and flattens it. Horrifying as the witch is, she's also arguably sympathetic, acting out of vengeance for her exile. A read that, to its credit, the games are sympathetic to, given their exoneration of Kedward as having done nothing wrong and not actually being responsible. Hecatomics, on the other hand, especially in Volume 3, just wants to take over the world because he's an evil spirit. He's attacking Blair because the new colonists didn't make sufficient sacrifices to him in the way the Native Americans did. The Blair Witch is a self-inflicted wound on Blair Township that left a lasting scar on the area, whereas Hecatomics, as a villain, especially the willingness of the Native Americans to placate him, demonises the Native Americans in the same way the witch trials demonised women, but without the self-reflective quality of that demonisation being the very cause of the harm itself. Again, this isn't an uncommon thing. Native American ghosts and spirits are a favourite of lazy American horror, but it's especially disappointing to see it crammed into a narrative which not only had a suitable villain already, but in which doing so has removed the existing potential for narrative complexity. It attempts to excuse this by including the Native Americans in the suffering. Their children have also been taken. The shaman is helping you to fight him in both volumes 1 and 3, but there's still a sense of infantilization of them. Until the white man showed up, they were willing to placate the demon with sacrifices, and it's only because of the player character that he could be defeated. It's exoticization and a white saviour narrative, all injected to a franchise that saw no benefit from either. Ironically, they made the change for the same reason that these are prequels and Kedward and Parr don't appear at all. With the production of a second film happening alongside development, the teams didn't want to mess up established canon or interfere with whatever would appear in Book of Shadows. The result managed to mess up the lore even worse than anything they could have possibly done set after the original film. After using the bones to reach hell with the serial numbers filed off, you eventually rescue the final child. The shaman holds off Hecatomics, appearing as a giant scorpion rather than the black mass of branches from Volume 1 while you escape. Returning to the real world, you face one last fight against the witch who has been helping you all game, now possessed by Hecatomics herself. Depending on whether you kill her or exorcise her instead affects the ending, though not by much. In one, Pry returns to his church, his faith restored. In the other, The witch hurls her heaving bosom at Pry, who turns her down in order to return to his church, his faith restored. It's an abrupt ending, but at least the final boss fight wasn't too annoying. I think. She got stuck on a rock and couldn't move for most of it in my case. It's difficult to say which strays more from the tone of the original Blair Witch Project, Book of Shadows and its Marilyn Manson title card, or the Blair Witch volumes and their action-focused, pulp-inspired, completely off-the-wall narrative of Native American demons and killing ghosts with axes. I don't hate them though. I'm not someone hugely concerned with canon or maintaining franchise integrity. The existence of these games doesn't do anything to detract from how good the original film is, and a better series of games wouldn't have improved it. Look at Blair Witch 2019, for example. Visually and tonally, it's far more in line with the franchise's roots, but even it fails to stick the landing with a convoluted, overwrought plot with terrible attitudes towards mental health. The volumes may not be good in any traditional sense, but it's nonetheless fascinating to see them flail wildly to try and adapt the films. The games in their own right are actually quite impressive given how tight the development schedule was, but that still leaves them as more of a curiosity than something worth playing for their own sake. Thanks for watching.